Osea Island, Essex, UK. Some tides don't just bring in the water, they bring back the things we tried to drown. The causeway to Osea Island is a narrow strip of gravel that the Blackwater estuary swallows twice a day, leaving you stranded in a silence so thick it feels like it's filling your lungs. I wasn't there for a vacation. I was there to clear out my uncle's cottage, a man who'd spent 40 years staring at the gray horizon until his heart simply gave up. By the time I arrived, the fog was rolling in, a cold, wet blanket that smelled of rotting seaweed and ancient secrets. Don't stay past the turn of the tide. The local boatman had warned me, his eyes skittering toward the mudflats. I should have listened. The cottage was a skeletal thing, creaking under the weight of the wind. Inside, the air was stale. I spent the afternoon boxing up old nautical charts and yellow journals. Around 6 p.m., a sound started. Low, wet rhythmic thumping, like a heavy boot hitting saturated mud. I froze. It was coming from the marsh behind the house. Thump, drag, thump, drag. I walked to the window. The fog was a wall of white, but I saw a shape. It was tall, too tall, and hunched over, moving with a hitching gait toward the back door. Is someone there? I called out. My voice sounded thin, fragile. No answer, only the thump drag getting closer. I checked the door. Locked. But then I heard it, a wet, slapping sound against the wood. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone was pressing their entire, sodden body against the door, trying to mold themselves to the cracks. Then, the whispering started. It wasn't behind the door, it was coming from the floorboards. The tide is high. Arthur, let us in before the salt takes us. My uncle's name was Arthur. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. My uncle had been dead for 3 weeks. I backed away into the kitchen, grabbing a rusted fillet knife. My mind was racing. Was this a prank? A squatter? No, the smell was too real. It was the smell of a stagnant grave. The slow, agonizing screech of wood being strained. I realized the person outside wasn't trying to open the door. It was trying to melt through it. I saw a dark, briny liquid beginning to seep under the threshold. It wasn't water. It was thick, like bile, and it moved with a purpose, snaking toward my boots. I bolted upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I hid in the master bedroom, pushing a heavy oak dresser in front of the door. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house groan. And then, the scratching started. Not on the door, on the window. I turned my flashlight toward the glass. Pressed against the second-story pane was a hand. But the skin was translucent, bloated, and covered in tiny, rhythmic moving barnacles. There were no fingernails, just jagged shards of shell. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just watched as a face drifted into the light. It had no eyes, just deep, dark pits filled with seawater. It opened its mouth, and a crab crawled out, scuttling across the glass. You have his eyes, the thing gargled. The dresser began to slide. Something was pushing from the other side with the strength of a hydraulic press. I realized then that my uncle didn't die of a heart attack. He died because the island finally decided to reclaim what he'd been looking at for 40 years. The twist. The next morning, the police found the cottage empty. The causeway was clear. They found my car, my phone, and my shoes. But when they checked the cellar, they found a single, fresh mound of wet salt and seaweed. Inside the mound, tucked neatly into the center, was my tongue, still warm and still twitching. Grosse Isle, Michigan, USA. On this island, the history isn't buried. It's just waiting for a host. Grosse Isle is beautiful in the way a funeral shroud is beautiful, elegant, but covering something dead. I took a job as a night security guard for one of the old Victorian estates on the southern tip of the island. The owner, a wealthy recluse named Mr. Vance, gave me one rule. Every door stays locked, and you never, ever use the 13th key on your ring. The house was a labyrinth of dark mahogany and velvet curtains. My footsteps echoed on the marble, sounding like two people walking instead of one. Smiley face, distant, muffled sobbing coming from behind a wall. On my third night, the power flickered. The island was hit by a Great Lakes gale that rattled the glass in the window frames. I was in the library when I heard it, a metallic clink from the basement. I checked my belt. The 13th key, an iron thing that looked like it belonged in a dungeon, was vibrating. I shouldn't have gone down. But the sobbing grew louder, turning into a frantic, rhythmic chanting. "Help us breathe. Help us breathe." I reached the basement door. It was a heavy, iron-reinforced slab. I felt a compulsion, a cold pull in my gut that I couldn't resist. I took the 13th key. My hand shook as I slid it into the lock. It turned with a sound like grinding bone, a heavy iron bolt sliding back with a resonant thud. The room beyond was not a cellar. It was a dry well, circular and deep, lined with thousands of small, white stones. Except, as I lowered my flashlight, I realized they weren't stones. They were teeth. Human teeth. Thousands of them, paved into the floor and walls. In the center of the room stood Mr. Vance. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was draped in a wet, gray hide that looked like it had been stitched from several different animals. He was holding a bowl of salt water. "You're early," he whispered, his voice sounding like two stones rubbing together. "The island usually waits until the first month to lure the guard down." "What is this?" I hissed, backing away. "Gross, I was a quarantine station," he said, stepping into the light. His skin was peeling back in long, dry strips. Thousands died of fever here. They were buried in mass graves, forgotten. But the soil here, it doesn't like to let go. It needs a mouth to speak through. It needs a body to hold the memories. He gestured to the walls. The teeth began to chatter. Smiley face, thousands of tiny clicking sounds, escalating into a roar. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut. I fumbled for the 13th key, but it was gone. I looked at my hand. The key wasn't on the ring anymore. It was under my skin, a long, iron bulge sliding up my forearm toward my elbow. "Don't fight it," Vance said, his own jaw unhinging in a way that no human jaw should. "The island needs a new historian. I've been tired for so long." The twist. I managed to escape that night. I jumped into the freezing river and swam until my lungs burned. I moved to the desert, as far from water as possible. But every morning when I wake up, I find a small, white human tooth on my pillow. And last night, when I looked in the mirror and opened my mouth to brush, I didn't see my own teeth. I saw a row of jagged, iron keys growing out of my gums. Destruction Island, Washington, USA. Sometimes the light isn't there to guide the ships. It's there to keep the things in the water from seeing us. Destruction Island sits off the coast of Washington like a jagged tooth broken off in a giant's mouth. It's a desolate, wind-whipped rock where the trees grow sideways and the Pacific Ocean screams against the cliffs 24/7. I took a contract job there as a structural surveyor for the old lighthouse. The Coast Guard had automated the light years ago, but the tower was leaning, and someone needed to see if the foundation was crumbling into the sea. "Don't go into the basement of the keeper's quarters," the captain of the supply boat told me as he dropped me off. "And if the light goes out, don't try to fix it. Just get in your tent and wait for dawn." I laughed it off. I've worked on oil rigs and mountain peaks. A little salt spray doesn't scare me. But as the boat disappeared into the gray mist, leaving me alone on that godforsaken rock, the silence of the island began to itch. It wasn't a true silence. It was the sound of 1,000 birds suddenly stopping their chatter every time I turned my back. The rhythmic, mechanical rotation of the lighthouse lens, a heavy, grinding clunk whir. The first night, the wind picked up to a gale. I was huddled in the kitchen of the old keeper's house, the floorboards groaning under my boots. Around midnight, the lighthouse beam, that steady, reassuring sweep of white, simply vanished. The room plunged into a darkness so absolute I felt like I'd been buried alive. Then, the scratching started. Not from the door, from the chimney. Rapid, frantic scratching of nails against brick, descending quickly. I scrambled for my industrial flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the fireplace. A cloud of soot puffed out, and then a hand reached out from the hearth. It was long, pale, and the fingers had too many joints. It felt around the floor blindly, its skin translucent like a deep-sea fish. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The hand stopped. Then, another hand followed. A head emerged from the soot, pale, hairless, and completely featureless where the eyes should have been. Just smooth, tight skin over a skull. It tilted its head, sniffing the air with jagged, slit-like nostrils. "New oil," it hissed. The voice sounded like wet sand being poured onto a drum. I didn't wait. I bolted for the stairs, heading for the lantern room at the top of the tower. I figured if I could get the light back on, whatever this thing was, this blind, subterranean nightmare, would retreat. Heavy boots sprinting up metal spiral stairs, echoing loudly. I climbed. 50 feet. 80 feet. My lungs were burning, the iron stairs slick with condensation. Below me, I heard it. It wasn't climbing the stairs. It was skipping them, leaping from railing to railing with terrifying agility. Clang, clang, clang. It was gaining on me. I reached the lantern room and slammed the heavy iron hatch, bolting it shut. I was panting, leaning against the glass. Outside, the storm was a frenzy of white foam and black waves. I looked at the massive Fresnel lens. It wasn't broken. Someone, or something, had draped a heavy, black, oily cloth over the entire glass assembly. I reached out to pull it off, but I stopped. There were words painted on the cloth in what looked like dried brown ink. Do not wake the horizon. A soft, wet thud against the glass from the outside of the lighthouse, 150 feet in the air. I turned my flashlight toward the darkness outside the glass. Pressed against the exterior of the lantern room were dozens of them. Scores of those pale, eyeless creatures, clinging to the brickwork like leeches. They weren't looking at me. They were all facing the ocean, their ears twitching. Then, the ocean moaned. It wasn't the wind. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very marrow of my bones. Out in the blackness of the Pacific, 2 miles offshore, a light clicked on. But it wasn't a lighthouse. It was a massive, golden eye, hundreds of feet wide, opening beneath the waves. The creatures on the glass began to wail, a high-pitched, harmonic shriek that cracked the inner pane of the lighthouse window. Glass cracking and shattering. "It sees," the creature from the chimney whispered. I looked down. It had squeezed through the ventilation duct in the floor. It was inches from my boots. The light was never to help the ships, little man. The light was to blind him. And you let it go out. I backed away, tripping over the lens gear. I realized then why the island was named Destruction. It wasn't because of the shipwrecks. It was a warning about what was anchored to the seabed beneath it. The twist. When the rescue team arrived 2 days later, they found the lighthouse light spinning perfectly. The island was peaceful. They found my journal on the kitchen table, but the last 10 pages had been eaten, literally chewed out of the binding. They found me sitting at the very top of the tower, staring out at the sea. I didn't speak to them. I haven't spoken since. Because when they shined a light in my face to check my vitals, they didn't see pupils or irises. My eyes are gone. In their place are 2 perfectly smooth, golden spheres, and every time I blink, I can still see that thing beneath the waves, waiting for the light to fail one more time. The 75 Road, the Kinmount Strait, southwest Scotland, UK. On the UK's most haunted highway, the price of a ride isn't money. It's your seat in the living world. The A75 is a ribbon of asphalt that cuts through the Scottish lowlands like a scar. Locals call it the Ghost Road, but I've always been a man of logic. To me, a road is just a road. Or it was, until I found myself driving a heavy-duty transit van through a thick, pea-soup fog near the Kinmount Strait at 3 a.m. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thump-thump of my tires over the road seams. The low hum of a diesel engine, followed by a sudden, sharp metallic tink, like a pebble hitting the windshield. I saw him in the periphery of my high beams. A man in a high-visibility vest, waving his arms frantically. In this part of the country, accidents are frequent and help is far away. I slammed on the brakes, the van sliding slightly on the damp surface. "Need a lift, mate? You okay?" I called out, rolling down the window. The air that rushed in was unnaturally cold, colder than the Scottish night had any right to be. The man didn't look at me. He kept his head down, his chin tucked into his chest. The van, it flipped, down in the ditch. My girl, she's still inside. "Jesus," I muttered, unbuckling my seatbelt. "Where?" He pointed a pale, trembling finger toward the darkness beyond the shoulder. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out. The fog felt oily against my skin. I followed him down the embankment, but the further we went, the quieter the road became. I couldn't even hear my own engine idling anymore. "I don't see a van, pal," I said, stopping. The man stopped too. He turned around slowly. His high-vis vest was shredded, and as the beam of my light hit his face, my stomach did a slow, agonizing flip. He didn't have a nose, just a ragged, cauterized hole in the center of his face. His eyes were wide, fixed, and completely bloodshot. "It's not a van anymore," he whispered. "It's a coffin, and it's too cramped for two." A wet, tearing sound, like Velcro being ripped apart, followed by a low, guttural growl. I bolted. I didn't look back. I scrambled up the embankment, my boots slipping on the slick grass. I reached the road and saw my van. The engine was still running, the headlights cutting through the mist. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it. I shifted into gear and floored it. But the van didn't move. The wheels spun fruitlessly, as if the back of the vehicle was being held down by a massive weight. I looked in the rearview mirror. The man wasn't behind the van. He was on it. His pale, mangled face was pressed against the back window, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of shadows were emerging from the fog. Men in 1950s suits, women in tattered wedding dresses, even children with hollowed-out eyes. They weren't walking. They were gliding, their feet never touching the asphalt. They began to surround the van. Tap, tap, tap. Thousands of fingernails clicking against the metal. The sound of metal groaning and glass spider-webbing under pressure. "Let us in," a chorus of voices hissed. It wasn't in my ears, it was inside my skull. "It's so cold out here. Just a few miles. Just to the next town." I looked at the passenger seat. My heart stopped. Sitting there, buckled in, was a woman. Her skin was blue, her hair matted with dried blood. She was holding a map, but the map was made of human skin. "You missed the turn," she said, her voice sounding like a radio tuning between stations. I looked out the windshield. The road was gone. In its place was a vast, endless field of rusted car wrecks, stretching as far as the fog would allow. Thousands of vehicles, all twisted and burned, and inside every one of them, a figure sat waiting. The twist. I woke up at dawn, slumped over the steering wheel. A police officer was knocking on the window. "You okay, son? You're parked in the middle of the straight." I nodded, shaking, and drove home. But when I got into my driveway and looked in the mirror to shave, I saw a bruise on my neck in the shape of a hand. And when I checked the back of my van, I found a pile of old, rusted hitchhiking signs. At the very bottom was a fresh one, written in my own handwriting, that simply said, "Take me home." I haven't left my house in 6 days. Every time I hear a car pass by, I feel a physical pull, like a hook in my chest, trying to drag me back to the A75. An abandoned psychiatric hospital, upstate New York, USA. They closed the asylum 40 years ago, but some patients are still waiting for their final discharge. Urban exploring is a rush until it isn't. My buddy Mark and I decided to hit the Blackwood Sanitarium, a sprawling ruin of red brick and broken glass nestled in the woods of New York. We weren't looking for ghosts. We were looking for liminal space, photos for our Instagram. The air inside Blackwood was thick with the smell of wet plaster and something sweet, like rotting fruit. We made our way to the hydrotherapy wing, the echo of a single water droplet hitting a tiled floor. Drip, drip, drip. "Hey, look at this," Mark said, pointing his camera at a row of rusted bathtubs. In the corner of the room, one tub was full. The water was black and stagnant, but it was shimmering, as if something was vibrating beneath the surface. I walked over, my camera shutter clicking. "Don't get too close, man," I joked. That's how the horror movies start. Suddenly, the heavy steel door behind us slammed shut. A massive boom of a metal door hitting a frame, followed by the sound of a deadbolt sliding. We both jumped. "Funny, Mark. Real mature," I snapped. "I didn't touch it." Mark's voice was an octave higher. He ran to the door and pulled. It wouldn't budge. It's locked from the outside. But there's no one out there, right? That's when the whispering started. It was coming from the vents. A frantic, hushed babbling of medical terminology and Latin prayers. "Patient 402. Lobotomy unsuccessful. Consciousness remains. Remove the eyes. Remove the eyes." I turned my flashlight toward the black water in the tub. A pair of hands, thin, skeletal, and wrapped in yellowed bandages, reached out of the water and gripped the porcelain rim. Then, a head emerged. It wasn't a face. It was a head wrapped entirely in gauze, with a single rusted surgical needle protruding from where the left eye should be. The thing didn't scream. It just tilted its head. "Is it time for my treatment?" it asked. The voice was that of a small child, but the body was that of an old man. Mark started screaming, kicking at the door. I backed into the center of the room, my light flickering. The other tubs, the empty, rusted ones, began to fill, not with water, but with a thick, viscous red liquid that smelled of iron. Sloshing water and the sound of many bodies rising at once. Figures began to sit up in the tubs. Some were missing limbs. Some had their mouths sewn shut with copper wire. They all turned toward us. "The doctors are here," the one with the needle whispered. "They've come to take the parts they missed." I watched in horror as Mark was grabbed, not by the ghosts, but by the shadows on the wall. The shadows reached out like oily tentacles, wrapping around his throat and dragging him toward the floor. He didn't even have time to yell. He was pulled into the concrete floor as if it were liquid. I ran to the window, but the glass wouldn't break. I hit it with my flashlight, but the plastic shattered while the glass remained pristine. I looked out. Outside, the woods were gone. There was only a white, sterile hallway that stretched forever. The twist. I'm writing this on a piece of scrap wallpaper I found. I've been in this room for 3 days. Or maybe it's been 30 years. There are no clocks here. Every few hours, the door opens, and a man in a pristine white coat walks in. He doesn't have a face, just a smooth surface of skin. He tells me I'm doing much better. He tells me that the mark I remember was just a symptom of my psychosis. But this morning, I found Mark's camera at the bottom of the black bathtub. I turned it on. The last photo isn't of the room. It's a photo of me, wearing a doctor's coat, holding a rusted needle, and smiling at the camera with eyes that aren't my own. Abandoned Motel, Route 66, Nevada, USA. They say you can check out anytime you like, but some guests never truly leave the dust of the Mojave behind. The neon sign of the Mojave Rest was flickering, a buzzing, dying MOTL that stabbed the inky blackness of the Nevada desert. I was driving across Country Hall, my eyes burning from the road, and my semi-truck was sputtering. It was 2 a.m., and I needed to sleep or I'd fall asleep at the wheel and become another statistic. The manager's office smelled of stale cigarettes and lavender air freshener, a cloying mix that coated my throat. A woman, her face mapped with deep wrinkles, took my cash without looking up. Room 108. Last one on the left. Don't let the sand in. The low buzz of a dying neon light, followed by the wind whistling over dry, cracked earth. I walked down the long, covered walkway. The air was still and dry, but I felt a cold draft clinging to my ankles. Room 108. The key turned with a satisfying click. The room was standard, beige walls, a sagged queen bed, and a TV that looked like it predated the lunar landing. I was too tired to care. I collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to undress. I woke up exactly an hour later. The silence was off. In the desert, there's always the sound of the wind or insects. But inside room 108, it was a vacuum. Then, I felt a drop of water hit my face. The sound of a water droplet hitting the floor, then another, dripping speed accelerating. I sat up, wiping my forehead. The ceiling above me was bone dry, but another drop hit my shoulder. I clicked on my flashlight. The water wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the mirror above the dresser. The glass was sweating, a thin sheen of water running down to the frame. I walked over to the dresser. The water smelled stale, like the bottom of a well. I pressed my hand against the mirror. It didn't feel like glass. It felt cold, yielding, like ice that was just about to crack. "Can you see us, John?" "My name isn't John." The voice didn't come from the room. It came from inside the mirror. The voice was distorted, like it was underwater. I looked closer. My reflection was looking back at me, but it was lagging a second behind my movements. I waved my hand. My reflection waved a second later. I blinked. My reflection didn't blink at all. Instead, my reflection smiled. A smile that was way too wide, showing too many teeth. A wet, gurgling sound coming from behind the mirror, like water being drained through clogged pipes. I backed away, grabbing my shoes. I needed to get out. I ran to the door and grabbed the handle. It was burning hot. I couldn't hold it. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection was gone. The mirror was now a window, and inside it, I saw room 108, but it was entirely submerged in water. Floating in the middle of the room were bodies, dozens of them, dressed in clothes from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Their eyes were wide open, their hair drifting like seaweed. We were so thirsty. The voices gargled in my mind. The desert takes so much. We just wanted a drink. The water in the mirror began to rise. A single pale hand, waterlogged and bloated, pressed against the other side of the glass. The glass began to crack. The loud snap of glass shattering, followed by a rush of water. I tripped on the rug, falling hard. I scrambled to my feet, but I wasn't in room 108 anymore. The door was gone. The TV was gone. I was in the water. I was floating above the bed, my own body looking up at me from the mattress below. I gasped, but my lungs filled with water. I realized I wasn't drowning. I was already dead. I had been dead the moment I stepped over the threshold. The twist. The next morning, the manager found the truck running in the parking lot. She walked to room 108. The door was locked from the inside. She used her master key and opened the door. The room was perfectly dry. The bed was unmade, and my clothes were folded neatly on the chair. But the mirror was perfectly clear. In fact, if you looked closely at the glass, you'd see a single, tiny figure standing in the very back of the beige room, screaming silently as a small, childlike hand slowly began to paint over the window with black ink. Brockenhurst, New Forest, UK. The New Forest is older than King's, and it has a long memory for the things we tried to prune. I've always loved the New Forest. Its ancient woodlands and sweeping heaths feel romantic, almost magical. But my perspective changed last November. I was hiking the outskirts of Brockenhurst with my dog, Buster. It was a crisp afternoon, the light filtering golden through the oak canopies. Buster, usually a standard-issue golden retriever, suddenly stopped. He didn't bark. He just whined, low and terrified, his ears pinned back against his skull. He was looking deeper into the dense tree line, where the path dissolved into thick undergrowth. "What is it, boy?" "A deer," I asked, though I already felt the temperature drop. The light seemed to turn a sickly shade of gray. A sudden, deep silence. The birds stop singing, the wind drops, only the sound of my breathing. I saw them first. Not trees. Figures. They were positioned perfectly within the spaces between the ancient oaks. They were tall, skeletal, and wrapped in some kind of gray, fibrous material that looked like a blend of wool and bark. Their arms were long, dangling past their knees, and their heads were tucked down, their faces hidden by shadows. They weren't moving. They were perfectly still, like statues. "Hey," I called out. "Is everything okay?" Buster yelped and bolted, not ahead of me, but past me, back toward the main road. I turned to look for him, and when I turned back, the figures were 50 feet closer. A dry, scraping sound, like tree branches rubbing together, but rhythmic and increasing in speed. They hadn't moved. I hadn't seen them walk. 1 second they were there, and the next, they were much, much closer. They were so close now that I could see their faces. They didn't have skin. Their faces were made of wood, carved with intricate, agonizing expressions, screaming mouths, and hollowed-out eyes. "You should have stayed on the path," a voice whispered. It didn't sound like a voice. It sounded like leaves rustling. The trees remember. They remember the axes. They remember the fires. They remember the blood. I ran. I didn't care about looking dignified. I was 30, crying like a child, sprinting through the thorny undergrowth. I could hear them behind me. Scrape, scrape, scrape. They were following me, closing the distance every time I looked away or turned a corner. The sound of heavy, rapid footsteps behind me, then suddenly stopping when I turned. I reached my car and dove inside, locking the doors. Buster was already under the seat, shaking. I looked out the window. The woods were peaceful. No figures. No wood-carved faces. I drove home in silence. I didn't go back to the New Forest. I started taking my walks in the city. But it didn't help. The first night, a crack appeared in my bedroom floorboard. It wasn't a crack from the house settling. It was a splinter. A long, sharp splinter of oak wood that pushed up through the carpet. The twist. I can't sleep anymore. Every night, the cracks in the house get bigger. I found a tiny sapling growing out of my tooth this morning. It wasn't a cavity. It was a perfect, miniature oak tree. And every time I look in the mirror, my skin looks a little greener, a little tougher. I went into my kitchen last night, and my feet had merged with the tile. I'm rooted. The voices from the forest aren't coming from outside my window anymore. They're coming from my own throat, a low rustling that says, "You're part of the history now." We all are. Abandoned ghost station near Holborn, London, UK. There are stations on the London Underground that haven't seen a train in 80 years, but the platforms are never empty. I work for TfL, Transport for London, as a night shift structural engineer. Most people think the tube is just a way to get to work, but when the power goes down and the commuters are gone, it's a living, breathing labyrinth of brick and damp air. My job was to inspect the ghost tunnels, sections of the Piccadilly line that were walled off during the Blitz. Don't spend more than an hour in the British Museum station, my supervisor told me, his eyes never leaving his clipboard. The air gets thin down there. You start seeing things when the oxygen drops. I didn't tell him I was bringing an oxygen monitor. I'm a man of science. I don't believe in seeing things. The distant, metallic screech of a train on a live track, muffled by miles of earth, followed by a low, rhythmic dripping. I squeezed through the access hatch and descended the rusted spiral stairs. The temperature dropped instantly. The walls were covered in soot that had been there since the 1940s. As I walked onto the abandoned platform, my flashlight beam hit the old posters. Bovril, War Bonds, and West End shows that had closed before I was born. Then, I heard the footsteps. The distinct clack-clack of leather-soled shoes on a tiled platform, echoing from the dark tunnel ahead. I stopped. The footsteps didn't. They came closer, steady and purposeful. I aimed my light toward the tunnel mouth. The beam hit a man. He was wearing a heavy wool coat and a flat cap, carrying a tattered leather briefcase. He was standing right at the edge of the platform, looking into the darkness where the tracks used to be. "Last train's gone, mate." I called out, my voice bouncing off the tiled walls. "This station is closed." The man didn't turn. "It's late," he said. His voice was thick, like he was speaking through a mouthful of wet wool. "The sirens have stopped, but the train hasn't come. My wife is waiting in Aldwick." "Sir, there are no trains here," I said, stepping closer. "This line was decommissioned in 1994. You shouldn't be here." The man turned his head. My flashlight flickered and died for a split second. When it came back on, his face was wrong. It looked like a charcoal drawing that had been rubbed out. No features, just gray smudges of soot where his eyes and mouth should be. "The air," he hissed. "It's so heavy." Suddenly, my oxygen monitor began to scream. Beep, beep, beep. The digital display showed 0%. The frantic, high-pitched alarm of a gas monitor. I gasped, but I couldn't draw breath. It wasn't that the air was thin, it was as if the atmosphere had turned to solid concrete. I fell to my knees, clawing at my throat. I looked at the man. He wasn't standing anymore. He was hovering, his body elongated, stretching toward the ceiling like smoke. Around him, more figures emerged from the soot-stained walls. Children in school uniforms, women with gas mask bags slung over their shoulders. They all began to crowd around me, their faceless heads tilting in unison. "Stay with us," a child's voice whispered in my ear. "The platform is safe. The bombs can't find us here." I felt their hands, cold, dry, and smelling of burnt dust, pressing against my skin. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to pull me into the wall. I saw the bricks behind me softening, turning into a dark, porous membrane. The twist. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. They said a fellow worker found me slumped against a wall in a service tunnel near Holborn. They called it acute carbon monoxide poisoning. I wanted to believe them, but when I got home and took off my work boots, I found my socks were filled with soot. And when I looked at the x-ray of my lungs the doctor gave me, I didn't see my ribs. I saw the distinct, perfect outline of a 1940s London Underground map, etched into my lung tissue in black, unerasable ash. A cornfield in rural Nebraska, USA. In the heart of the Midwest, the scarecrows aren't there to keep the birds away, they're there to keep us in. My car broke down on a dirt road somewhere between nowhere and oblivion. My GPS was a useless blue dot in a sea of green. Nebraska in August is a furnace, and the corn on either side of the road was 10 feet tall, a rustling, golden wall that seemed to hum with the heat. I started walking toward what I thought was a farmhouse. The silence was heavy, broken only by the dry shuck-shuck of the corn leaves rubbing together. The sound of a crow cawing sharply, then a sudden, eerie silence. I saw the first scarecrow about a mile in. It was crude, burlap sack for a head, dressed in filthy denim overalls, tied to a wooden cross. But as I passed it, I noticed the hands. They weren't made of straw. They were made of gray, desiccated skin, with fingernails that looked like they'd been chewed down to the quick. Great, I muttered, my throat parched. Some local horror fan is having a laugh. I reached the farmhouse by sunset. It was a rotting, two-story Victorian that looked like it was being swallowed by the corn. On the porch sat an old man in a rocking chair. He was holding a glass of what looked like cloudy water. "Car trouble?" he asked. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but he seemed to be looking right through me. "Yeah. Is there a phone?" "Phone lines went down in the '93 storm," he said, gesturing to his seat. "Stay a while. Silas will be by soon. He handles the harvest." I didn't like the way he said harvest. I turned to leave, but the road I'd walked in on was gone. Where the dirt path had been, there was now only solid, impenetrable corn. It had grown behind me, faster than any plant should. A low, rhythmic drumming sound coming from deep within the cornfield. "What is that?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "That's the heartbeat of the field," the old man said. "The corn needs a soul to keep the stalks green. Every 40 years, Silas finds a traveler, someone who won't be missed." I bolted off the porch, running into the corn. I didn't care about the road anymore. I just wanted to get away from the house. But the corn was a maze. Every direction looked the same. The stalks felt like they were reaching out, their sharp leaves slicing at my arms. I tripped over something soft. I looked down. It was a pair of glasses, the same ones I'd seen in my own reflection that morning. Beside them lay a wallet. My wallet. I reached for it, but a hand grabbed my wrist. The sound of a heavy, wet sack hitting the ground. Silas was standing there. He was 12 feet tall, his body a literal trunk of corn husks, his face the same burlap sack I'd seen on the road. But the sack was pulsing. It was breathing. "The soil is hungry," Silas gargled. He didn't use a knife. He just pointed at me, and I felt my feet begin to itch. I looked down. My shoes were bursting at the seams as thick. White roots began to grow out of my ankles, diving deep into the Nebraska dirt. The twist. The next time a car broke down on that road, the driver saw a new scarecrow. It looked remarkably realistic. It even wore a modern wristwatch and a t-shirt from a tech conference. The traveler stopped to take a photo, laughing at how creepy it was. But as he turned to walk away, he heard a muffled, screaming voice coming from inside the burlap head. He ignored it, thinking it was just the wind in the corn. But as he drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the scarecrow slowly, painfully, raise its wooden arm and point directly at his license plate. Interstate 80, the Great Basin Desert, Utah/Nevada border, USA. On the loneliest road in America, the next service sign isn't a promise, it's a threat. The high desert at night is a different kind of quiet. It's a silence that rings in your ears, a predatory stillness that makes you feel like a bug under a microscope. I was driving a midnight stretch of I-80, the salt flats shimmering like frozen milk under a moonless sky. My gas light had been on for 20 miles, and the next service, 50 miles sign felt like a death sentence. Then, out of the darkness, a neon sign flickered, Petrolube and Diner, open. It wasn't on my GPS. It wasn't on the paper map. But I was desperate. I took the exit, a long, curving off-ramp that seemed to descend much deeper than the surrounding geography allowed. The gravel crunching under tires, followed by the erratic ping-ping of a cooling engine. The diner was a silver humpy-dumpy trailer from the 1950s. Inside, the air was freezing, smelling of ozone and burnt coffee. A single waitress sat at the counter, her back to me. She was wearing a yellow uniform that looked brand new, despite the thick layer of dust covering everything else in the room. "Full tank of unleaded?" she asked. She didn't turn around. Her voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "Yeah, and a coffee to go," I said, leaning against the counter. She turned. Her face was perfectly symmetrical, too perfect. Her eyes didn't have whites. They were just solid, glassy blue, like marbles. She didn't move her mouth when she spoke. The sound came from her chest. "You're the first one to take the exit in a long time," she said. "Most people just drive over us." "Over you?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. She pointed to the ceiling. I looked up. Above the fluorescent lights, the ceiling was made of glass. And through that glass, I saw the bottom of a road, The underside of I-80. I saw the tires of semi-trucks and cars screaming overhead, but they were miles away, tiny and distorted. A low, rhythmic thumping from above, like a heartbeat, echoed through a highway. "The exit doesn't go back up," she whispered. "It only goes further in." I backed away toward the door, but when I pushed it open, I wasn't in the parking lot. I was in the kitchen. I ran back through the kitchen, but I ended up in the diner bathroom. Every door I opened led back into the same silver trailer. "I need to leave," I hissed, my voice cracking. "You already did," she replied. She walked to the window and pulled the blind. Outside, there were no salt flats. There were hundreds of cars, sedans, trucks, motorcycles, all parked in perfect rows. And inside every car, a person sat behind the wheel, staring at the empty road ahead with the same glassy blue eyes. The sound of a car door slamming, then another, then 100 at once. "We're the ones who didn't make the distance," she said. "The desert doesn't just take your life. It takes your destination. You're just a part of the landscape now." I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. I started the engine and floored it, aiming for the dark horizon. I drove for hours. I watched the odometer. 10 miles, 50, 100. But the neon sign of the diner never got smaller. It stayed right behind me, its buzzing light reflected in my rearview mirror, no matter how fast I went. The twist. I stopped the car when I ran out of gas. I sat there in the dark, waiting for the sun. But the sun never came. It's been weeks. I don't feel hungry anymore. I don't feel tired. I just feel empty. Last night, I looked out my window and saw a car take the exit. A silver sedan. It looked just like the one my brother drives. I watched him pull up to the diner. I watched him walk inside. I wanted to scream, to tell him to turn around. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. Instead, I felt something hard and smooth in my eye sockets. I looked in the mirror, and a pair of glassy blue marbles stared back. "I'm not a driver anymore. I'm the next service sign, and I can see you coming from a mile away."